Hello, everybody will have a seat. We'll get started. Good evening. I'm Deborah Polsky. I'm the Executive Director of the Dallas Jewish Historical Society, and we're so thrilled to welcome you here tonight to the first of this year's edition of our annual lecture series. Although our series has been going on for well over 10 years, bringing in locally and nationally known speakers on subjects of interest to the Dallas Jewish community, thanks to a generous donor, we were able to rename our series in honor of Jim Schwartz of blessed memory, the immediate past president of the Historical Society. A strong leader, Jim Schwartz is remembered for the remarkable strides made at the Dallas Jewish Historical Society during his 4-year tenure as president, maintaining strong fiscal responsibility, offering meaningful and successful programs and fundraising events, and being instrumental in moving the organization forward in delivering full archival digitization. Hard to say. Best known for his warmth and his menschlichkeit, as well as his dedication to the growth of the Dallas Jewish community and the Dallas Jewish Historical Society, we're thrilled to have this opportunity to honor Jim with this annual series of lectures. Tonight's program is organized in partnership with the Goldring Woldenberg Institute of Southern Jewish Life, or ISJL, as some of you may know. Founded in 2000 and based in Jackson, Mississippi, the Institute supports education, rabbinical services, cultural programming, history, and community engagement. The ISJL builds community by partnering with diverse Jewish congregations, churches, universities, and civic organizations across 13 southern states. Through this unique approach, the ISJL provides a visionary model of regional cooperation through which communities large and small assume a shared responsibility for Jewish life throughout the South. Our guest tonight is Dr. Josh Parshall. Dr. Parshall is the ISJL's historian. He served as oral historian from 2009 to 2013, then enrolled at the University of North Carolina to pursue a PhD in American Studies. The intersection of politics and Jewish identity is one of his areas of interest. His research has been published in the journal Southern Jewish History and presented at the annual meetings of the Southern Jewish Historical Society, the American Studies Association, and the Association for Jewish Studies. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Josh Parshall.
Thanks for the introduction. It's really it's nice to be here. What was I going to say? It's debating on when to talk about how my wife is from Dallas, so it's like I get to come here a lot, and it's cool that my father-in-law is here, and he can sort of see me in action. Hopefully he enjoys that. Yeah, I'll get okay. Is that a little better? Okay, great. So we're going to start with a really exciting pie chart. That's too far. That's not a pie chart. All right. So I start this talk as one of my predecessors, Stuart Rockoff, started his version of this talk, which is to say that Jews in the South, Southern Jews, are in many respects a double minority, right? As you would guess, Jews are a religious minority in the region of the South. They're also a minority among American Jews, right? 7% of American Jews live in the South if we don't count Florida, and whether or not we count Florida is the whole thing, but that Florida wedge you see, which is 8.7% of American Jews, right? 95% of that is in South Florida, right? Is in Miami-Dade, Broward, and Palm Beach counties, which, however southern they are historically, since World War II, I think I would argue, have had a somewhat divergent path. I'm like knee-deep in Florida research right now for our online encyclopedia of Southern Jewish communities, which I'll tell you a little bit more about later. So I've got Florida on my brain. I came here with the intention of talking a lot about Texas, but there's going to be a lot of Florida too, because that's just where I'm living right now. At any rate, As you can see here, right, more, is there a way to turn off the mouse aspect of this?
I don't know.
I just feel like it's distracting. Yeah.
I'll ask.
I'll just point it down. Anyways, so as we can see here, right, more Jews live in Florida than the rest of the South combined. More Jews also live in Brooklyn than the non-Florida South combined. Again, sort of emphasizing this double minority status. Texas, for its part, at last count, has 166,000 Jews or so. That's 0.6% of all Texans, and that's 2.3% of American Jews. So like if we apportioned Jews out like equally by state, Texas would have its fair share, only it's Texas, right? So it ought to have a little more than that. Anyways, despite the sort of double minority status, despite in some ways being marginal to the broader American Jewish story, and in some ways you could argue at least statistically marginal in the American South, right? Jews have had a long presence in the region and have really been able to build homes for themselves in many ways here. So today's talk is about sort of how they've built those homes. Because I'm going to be up here for about an hour, and because it's a Thursday evening and you don't want to just listen to me talk, we're going to do something a little different today, and we're going to focus on a number of pictures. And I actually want to open it up and have y'all help me sort of talk about those pictures. We're going to start with this one. You can just sort of shout out, and I'll repeat it back so everyone can hear. What are we looking at in this picture? What do we see?
Arkansas.
Temple is it?
A shul in Arkansas.
It's a shul in Arkansas. I'm not sure how you know that, but that's exciting to me. Okay, and shul's a strong word. This is very much a temple.
Okay.
Yeah, this is a temple, for sure. So what have we got? What else?
Multiple generations.
You've got multiple, okay, you've got a group of people, multiple generations. One of them might be me.
Your mother?
Well, okay. Slow down. All right, let's start with the basics. Okay, so we've got a synagogue. We know that because there's a sign that says Temple Israel. We've got a group of people. There is a suggestion that they might be related to one another. When do we think this picture was taken? We think it might be about a bar mitzvah.
Or high holiday.
What year do you think this was taken? Oh no, it's much more recent than that. I heard a 90s, a 2000. Okay. What do you think the relationship between these people is? Right. You've got some grandparents, right? You've got a mother with 2 children. The woman there in the middle is my Aunt Helen. Yes, this is me. This is Blytheville, Arkansas in 1997. Okay, so if you could zoom in back here, you would see a cornerstone that reads roughly 1947. Temple Israel in Blytheville, Arkansas was built at that point. My grandmother from St. Louis had married my grandfather about that time, so it was as they were young married people, the community in Blytheville had built sort of its first new synagogue. They actually lived in Katy, Missouri in the Boot Heel, so 40-ish minutes away, and they would drive down for services pretty regularly. How did you know this was Blytheville? I
read up on you today.
Okay. He said he read up on me today, so okay, so someone did intel, okay. One other thing, just if you're interested in synagogue architecture, it's hard to tell here. The synagogue is built kind of in this like mid-century Moorish style. Right, which tells you about when it was built, tells you a little bit about sort of American synagogue architectural history and the ways that mid-century architects were looking for different kinds of inspiration to build Jewish sacred spaces, a number of other things. Anyways, okay, so that we've got at least some practice shouting out and talking about images, because we're going to stop and do that several times. Back to the long history of Jewish life in the South. Jewish communities in the South precede the existence of the United States, right? So the first Jews to really arrive in the region come to Charlestown, South Carolina, now Charleston, in the 1690s. And they arrived from England and from English possessions in the Americas. South Carolina, at the time of their arrival, was actually more welcoming than many of the other American colonies. This clicker goes too fast. I'm not going to ask you to read this, both because it's convoluted and because the F's are S's, or the other way around. But the Constitution of South Carolina, as a colony, was actually written by John Locke, right, the famous Enlightenment philosopher, and it enshrined a certain level of religious freedom as a value of this new colony, right? What you would notice if you read this closely is, so Jews, heathens, and other dissenters are specifically named as people who are allowed to settle there, who have political rights. And if you talk to the Jews of Charleston, they're very sort of big on, the way that they've sort of been woven into the fabric of the city since fairly early on. If you read this text closely, though, the reason that Jews, heathens, and other dissenters, the reason that their presence is justified is in large part the idea that by being integrated into a Christian society, they will become Christian themselves and they will assimilate. So that while we can say, yes, there's a level of, there are civic rights and there's acceptance, right? That acceptance is based on the assumption of Christianity and white Christianity as the norm. And I would use that to sort of temper some of our excitement over this sort of tolerance that we see here. But that said, South Carolina was actually very accepting at the time, right? Especially when we compare it to Massachusetts and Connecticut, Puritan colonies where Jews weren't allowed to settle yet, or New York City, which actually had more Jews at that point, but where they were not yet allowed to establish a synagogue. Texas at this point is claimed by Spain, is still in large part under indigenous control, right? This is just like a sort of, if you're interested in American Indian history, the Comanche Indians controlled a large part of Texas for a long time, and it's worth reading that history because it's fascinating. The other sort of center besides Charleston is, of course, Savannah. Jews arrive in Savannah in 1734. A group of 40 Jews arrive, not long after the colony's founding. And Governor James Oglethorpe rents them a part of his own land to live on, as well as a building to use as a synagogue. So on arrival, 1734 or thereabouts, they found the first congregation in the American South in Savannah. I would point out, however, that at the time period we're talking about, the South isn't quite the South yet. So here's a map, it's a rough map I threw together of Jewish communities in the Americas that exist prior to 1790. They don't all exist through 1790, but they're there. This was based on, it's a little bit quick and dirty, but let's talk about this map for a minute. What strikes you about it?
I think Newport had the first synagogue in
It was Newport, right? Yeah. But everything's on the East Coast.
Surprising there's so many in the
ports.
Right, so we're talking about ports, right? Exactly. Anything else?
New York belonged to the Dutch at that point.
Right, New Amsterdam belongs to the Dutch. Dutch are relatively tolerant on Jews. Right, so we're talking about, port cities and port Jews, right? And they're tied together by kinship networks, by trade networks, and they're really a part of what sort of this circumatlantic sort of trade network, what Dale Rosengarten has written about sort of those southern communities, Savannah and Charleston, is part of a Gulf Caribbean plantation region, right? In many ways at this time we can talk about Savannah and Charleston not as the bottom of the United States, right, but as the top of the Gulf and the Caribbean. And they're very much, again, these are economies based on based on sugar, based on rice, based on enslaved people and their labor, right? And sort of that sort of classic diagram of like the triangular trade across the Atlantic, right? And we see Jews as very much part of that, and so the places they land are dictated by those economies, as well as which sort of colonial power is in charge, right? English and Dutch possessions are more tolerant. So Recife, for example, has a Jewish community, and then when Portugal takes back over that part of the world, right, they actually leave and sort of are the seeds for several of these other communities. So anyways, that's sort of one of my big sort of ideas I like to do is like, know that the South wasn't always the South, and at one point really it's part of this other sort of region. So, you've got all these places. They're still pretty small Jewish communities, right? And that's true in the South as well. So in Savannah, you've got a peak of 70 Jews during the colonial era. In Charleston, even though the Jews have been there for a long time, you've only got 12 Jewish families in 1750. At which point they found the first Charleston congregation, Kahal Kadosh Bet Elohim. After the Revolution, the American Revolution, Charleston's Jewish population did grow fairly quickly, and it was one of the more significant Jewish communities in the early Republic. So what's notable about these sort of southern colonial settlements is this relative acceptance of Jews in the region. They have freedom to worship, and they're also allowed to contribute to the civic life of these colonial port cities. So in 1765, you have 2 Savannah Jews elected as port officials, and then you have Francis Salvador in South Carolina. He serves as in the first Provisional Congress in 1774, remains in the State Assembly after the United States gains its independence, and helps to draft the state constitution. This sets a precedent for the development of Jewish communities elsewhere in the South. And in fact, we think of American Jewish life as always having been as based in New York and always having been that way. But up to 1820, Charleston had more Jews than New York City. At that point, there were 700 Jews in Charleston and only 500 in New York City. Texas, was like getting its first Jews at that point in time, right? Jews come to Texas around the time of Anglo settlement. And congregations don't develop for another 30 years or so. So this is a painting of the interior of Kehillah Kadosh Bet Elohim, KKBE, in Charleston. This painting was actually done after this building burned down, and it was done from memory, so this isn't probably an exact representation, but gives us a sense of the space and of the building. So what can we learn about the community from looking at this image? Orthodox, how do we know? Balcony for the women. This is, the crowd knows a couple things. And we think that, right, Sephardic because of? Right, we've got a bema and a center, right? So this is very much, we can see that there was a fairly European mode of worship there. Anything else?
Now, European churches look like that too, and not based on separation at all. Looks very much like a lot of European churches.
It's dark and not decorated.
No, it's light, it had windows.
So it's a little stark. It's interesting, I mean, the windows aren't stained glass, for one thing, which we might expect. But still, to have a 2-story structure like this with what looks to be a pretty large and somewhat ornate art does speak, I think, to a certain level of economic success, although it's not as ornate as we might imagine. Anything else?
When was the fire, you said?
The fire was shortly after 1800, and then I think this painting was done around 1810. That's about right.
Was it accidental or arson?
I think this was a big fire that took down like a huge swath of Charleston. No, this was not arson. So this predominance, this sort of significance of Charleston as a center of American Judaism, right? There's an attempt to form like a reformed splinter group there, which is not continuous with the development of American Reformed Judaism, but the Charleston folks will tell you is a really important sort of anticipation of it. It was a pretty short-lived predominance, right? So as I said, 1820, you've got a couple hundred more Jews in Charleston than in New York City. By 1830, New York City has twice as many Jews as Charleston, and by 1860, Charleston still has 700 Jews, and New York City has reached 40,000 Jews. So, 30 years can make a difference. And this is really a consequence of the first large-scale Jewish migration to the United States, right, which drives growth in the urban north, both because of sort of the economic dynamics, right? There's more opportunity in the north, which is sort of seeing greater urbanization, greater industrialization, as well as sort of once you get a critical mass of Jewish people, more Jewish people want to move there, right? Because you have the infrastructure for Jewish religious life and for Jewish cultural life. There are also significant challenges for a European migrant to settle in the South, right? And these are true in much of the South. You've got tropical disease, which was an issue in Florida, in Mississippi, in New Orleans, in Houston for a good bit of the 19th century. Less infrastructure, which both is an issue for sort of quality of life, but also for if you are a trader, if you're a merchant, right, you need to be able to get goods and ship goods out. And as the infrastructure developed a little more slowly in the South, it was a little less attractive. And in parts of the South, you also did have strong American Indian resistance to Euro-American settlement. This is certainly true in Florida with the Seminoles, as well as in Texas, sort of outside of East and Southeast Texas. Still, though, the South does draw Jews. On the eve of the Civil War, an estimated 13% of American Jews live in the South, right, in the more rural South. So let's look at one of them. Isaac Wolf Bernheim came to Kentucky from Baden in the late 1860s, slightly later than sort of what I was mentioning, but is pretty representative in some ways of the mid-century the mid-19th century Jewish migrant. So what strikes you about him? What makes us say that? Yeah, he's right. He's got these packs, he's carrying a bunch of stuff. We assume that he's a peddler. Also, we know that a lot of Jews were peddlers. Anything else about him?
He eventually became a distiller and he had a significant, in fact, there's a bourbon today that's still named after him.
Yeah, so that's actually a great point, right? So he comes over as a young man, right? Most of these migrants were men, and they, oftentimes they would send for family members or go back and find a woman to marry and bring her back, that sort of thing. But what we see is an influx of young men who begin as peddlers. They come in, they find their way to a trading hub, they load up with goods, right, and they set out into the countryside, right? And this is sort of the result in the 1840s and 1850s of unrest, both political unrest and economic turmoil in Central Europe, especially the German-speaking territories, right? And becoming a peddler is fairly cheap. You don't need a lot of startup, right? You don't need a lot of specialized skills. Some of these folks were in sort of merchant occupations back in Europe or had some experience with them. And a lot of them in Europe hadn't really been able to rely on major businesses, on state institutions, on universities for their livelihood, and had been used to working for themselves or came from families that were used to working for themselves. And so peddling made a lot of sense for them, especially in these sort of developing market hubs of the rural South. In addition to sort of coming in and peddling, right, then a natural sort of pathway for business for American Jews and for Southern Jews is also peddler supply. And you see that in Texas. So the Sanger brothers arrive first in sort of southeast Texas, and as the railway comes up through the state, they establish stores at each new railroad point. And Alex and Philip Sanger come to Dallas in 1872 and open up a branch of the Sanger department store, but shortly after they also open up a wholesale business for shop owners and for peddlers, many of whom were also Jewish. And so you see sort of Jewish religious networks and Jewish kinship networks also being sort of used as economic networks. So you get this chain of sort of supply throughout the South based on Jewish peddling. And then once peddlers acquire enough capital, right, they set down roots in a town that looks nice to them. So by the late 19th century, you've got Jews established sort of in business in much of the eastern and southeastern Texas, as well as San Antonio, El Paso, and a few more distant cities. Of course, the major American events of this period include the Civil War and Reconstruction. Here we've got Leon Fischel, who served in the Civil War, and sort of as in other parts of the South, Jewish Texans identified largely but not exclusively with the Confederacy, and they supported it either as soldiers or civilians. Sort of one key example, in Marshall, Texas, you have the Kahn brothers, Emmanuel Kahn and Lionel Kahn. Emmanuel joined the Confederacy when the war broke out, while Lionel served in the Union Army, right? Despite sort of fighting on separate sides of the conflict, Lionel returns to Marshall after the war and sort of joins the business community there. There doesn't seem to have been sort of an ongoing feud, despite these brothers being on the opposite sides of the Civil War. So again, there's a fair amount of literature on on Jews and enslavement, on Jews and their relationship to the Civil War. Some Jews in the South seemed fairly enthusiastic, just to sort of adopt what they viewed as the Southern cause, whereas some others, took the opportunity to either sort of stick to Union strongholds or to fight for the Union Army. But in general, I think you see the majority of Jews sort of going along with the Confederate side. In much of the South, Reconstruction following the war meant slow recovery, it meant political violence, but it also meant opportunities to consolidate wealth. This example of political violence, you've got a few of these, but in Marianna, Florida, in 1869, a merchant named Samuel Fleischman was murdered. He was not murdered for being Jewish. He was murdered for supporting the political rights of freedmen, of recently emancipated African Americans, and he was murdered for supporting Republican politics. He had been warned to get out of town by sort of one of these roving bands of sort of like redemptionist white supremacists. He initially left, fearing for his life, but he was actually on his way back to Marianna in an attempt to, I believe, recoup some merchandise from the store or some property, and he was murdered on the way back. Here in Texas, you did have widespread Klan violence as well. There was very little sort of federal oversight in the years after the war, but I don't know offhand of specifically anti-Jewish violence that took place here. And again, even in the cases like Samuel Fleischman, and there's a similar case in Louisiana, it doesn't seem that Jewishness was a major cause. It had more to do with these other sort of political differences. With that slow recovery during Reconstruction, the opportunities, however, were that there was an emerging consumer economy, right, that was developing to replace the plantation economy of enslavement that had been in place prior to the war. And that meant that you had African Americans with more cash in their hands for the first time, and even more often than that, who were needed the extension of credit in order to buy goods for their families, in order to buy goods for small farms. And so you've got a new consumer economy that's coming in. And as Jews come in, they peddle, they start dry goods stores, they develop these debt networks that stretch throughout the region, as well as kinship networks and religious networks. And as they start to have success, they also buy land. They become landowners, which means that they've got, oftentimes tenant or sharecropper farmers working for them. And sort of as they become more and more established, of course, we see the beginnings of Jewish institutional life sort of spreading throughout the region. So in Texas, the first, Houston first started reporting minions in 1837, and local Jews bought land for a cemetery in 1854, and then started Texas's first Jewish congregation, Beth Israel, in 1859. And just to sort of reinforce, yeah, there were merchants, right? So you got 32 men that initially found the congregation, and the majority of them are store owners. Here in Dallas, Jews founded a Hebrew Benevolent Association in 1872, purchasing land for a synagogue the same year. Benevolent Association members founded Congregation Emmanuel in 1874, which was the fourth Jewish congregation in the state. So I've mentioned Houston as the first Texas city to have a congregation. The next is Galveston. The third is a little bit more surprising. What? Jefferson. Yeah, and so, I mean, some of these early developments are kind of surprising. What you can see with some of these, right, is in part, right, you've got places that were really boom towns in the late 19th century that aren't even, I mean, they're on the map now, but...
On the water, and when the train didn't come through, that was...
Right. Okay, so it's all about trade networks, right? Okay, so Jefferson's on the water, the train skips it, it's all over for Jefferson, exactly. Right, and we can talk about, you can talk about, in the 20th century, you can talk about the same sorts of things making and breaking cities in regard to interstates. That's great, I hadn't realized that about Jefferson, that makes a lot of sense. By 1880, you've got synagogues in 4 additional Texas cities: San Antonio, Austin, Waco, and Hempstead. Another 19th century boomtown that is not what it once was. So this environment, I've talked a little bit about sort of about political violence as part of Reconstruction, along with sort of these opportunities to really make a name for oneself and amass wealth. And that sort of double-edged sword of danger and success continues into the early 20th century. So in 1913, the body of Mary Fagan was found in the basement of a pencil factory near Atlanta. Before long, Leo Frank, a manager in that factory, was sort of identified as the prime suspect. He was convicted. Interestingly, he was convicted primarily on the testimony of an African American man, which is somewhat unusual in the South at that time, that a white jury would accept that testimony, in part because in the run-up to the trial, there was sort of a strong anti-Semitic campaign against Leo Frank. Right? His conviction was commuted rather, to a life sentence, at which point he was lynched in 1915. A mob took him out of jail and lynched him. And this happened very much in the context of a rise from the 1890s to the 1920s in American nativism. Right? And the Leo Frank case you can't avoid it in Southern Jewish history, and I've always had a really hard time sort of articulating what it really means. Because in some ways it is so exceptional. In some ways it is so different than the general experience, but yet you can't avoid it as something that was really symbolically powerful for Jews, and especially Jews in Atlanta. I mean, people talk about there being sort of a generational effect of this, of Atlanta Jews really wanting to sort of keep their heads down and not attract attention in some ways. But that said, in some ways it is so outside sort of the normal order of what was happening with Jews in the South. That said, it was also indicative of this rise of nativism and American nationalism between the 1890s and the 1920s, right? Which is expressed really strongly in Texas with the rise of the Ku Klux Klan. I should note here that if I look nervous, right, which a couple points, it's because Brian Stone is here, who wrote the book on Texas Jews. So every time I talk about this, I'm like, oh man, I hope. Anyways, as scholars like Brian Stone have so rightly pointed out, in Texas, right, part of the way that you see this rise of nativism into the 1920s is with the rise of the Klan. And it's a significant issue that Jews in the South have to figure out how they're going to, whether or not they're going to sort of stand up and say that, the Klan is anti-Semitic and the Klan is supports immigration restrictions that are going to hurt our families and our communities, or are they going to try to sort of keep their heads down and wait for the storm to pass? Let alone are they going to address the Klan's anti-black racism and violence. At any rate, this rise of nativism, which we see sort of most clearly articulated in the lynching of Leo Frank, has to do in large part with anxieties over industrialization and urbanization, right? In Mary Fagan, you had the figure of a white Christian woman being corrupted by industry and by an urban environment in a way that ultimately leads to her death. And there are a number of sort of anti-Semitic ideas that sort of that grow out of these anxieties, or that are sort of fanned in the context of these anxieties, notably about sort of Jewish economic difference, Jewish economic sort of parasitism, and also sort of ideas about Jewish sexual perversion, right, which Leo Frank seemed to have embodied to the anti-Semitic folks who really were focusing in on him as their prime suspect. All that said, what you also see in this period is a really significant sort of philo-Semitism, and a sense among the boosters of small and medium-sized towns that the arrival of Jews and Jewish merchants was a good thing and bode well for a town. So here you've got a newspaper ad. I don't know, I'm sorry about this pointer. I feel like it's really... I apologize. Anyways, so you've got this newspaper ad, big stock, new goods. Don't forget that the Jews are in it, with the best and most complete line of spring goods ever brought to Huntington, right? So this is an ad taken out by Jewish merchants who are so comfortable, right, who want to announce, hey, the Jews are here, because they know that there's a significant population in town who sees that as exciting. who sees, oh, our town must be on the rise if we're attracting Jewish merchants, and this customer base is going to be excited because they associate Jewish merchants, with a good deal. And you see this in town after town, right? You see in a place like this, in small town Texas, right? When a synagogue gets built, local churches are donating money as well as local civic groups. When a synagogue gets dedicated, right, the mayor and other sort of local dignitaries are there to, either at the cornerstone laying or to welcome the Torah or whatever sort of ceremony happens, right? So there is this nativism, there is this sort of concern, but there's also a great deal of sort of acceptance and excitement. And you see that probably most clearly in the election of Jewish mayors. So this, I just like this picture. So this is it Carol or Carol? Carol, okay, so this is Lewis Carroll Sr. on the right, and Lewis Carroll Jr. on left. Lewis Carroll Sr. served as mayor of Marshall, Texas, not terribly far from here, from 1935 to 1947. His daughter-in-law, Audrey, who is in attendance here, was also mayor of Marshall, 94 to 2001? When were you mayor?
I didn't understand.
The dates?
When were you mayor? Oh, when was I mayor?
Yeah.
I was on the commission from 1991 to 2001.
Okay. Yeah, so you see this sort of deep, this family's deep connection to the civic life of this town, right? Now these examples are, 1930s and 1990s, but even before that, you had, in Galveston, you had Michael Seligson, elected in 1853, and 4 other Jewish mayors since him. In Schulenburg, Michael C. Levy served 3 terms, 1883 to 1889, and of course, more recently, Dallas has had 3 Jewish mayors of its own. Right? And so this sort of civic involvement testifies to the way that people came in. Jews came in, they built businesses for themselves, they gained a certain reputation in town. They were thought of as being somewhat cosmopolitan and somewhat progressive, I think, and sort of seen as good leadership, right? And of course, being mayor, serving your city is also good business. And so you see a really significant representation of Jews across the South, including here in Texas, in these sort of mayoral posts. In Brookhaven, Mississippi, there's a man named Hal Samuels. He served several terms in the 50s and 60s, but I was seeing the Christmas lights, which, it's not Thanksgiving yet, but seeing the Christmas lights in some of the neighborhoods on the drive here reminded me that Hal Samuels of Brookhaven, Mississippi was, I believe, regularly headed up the town's Christmas parade, I think dressed as Santa, right? And again, sort of like these ways that Jews in these southern cities really are able to integrate themselves into the civic life and into the cultural life. Now we've gotten well into the 20th century, and of course there's a major change that has happened among American Jews and among Southern Jews right at this point. What's this? It's a map of in Yiddish. Yeah, so you won't be able to read it. This map was originally published by the Industrial Removal Office, okay? Which was an organization that sought to take Jews from the urban Northeast and spread them evenly across the country so as to attract less of that nativism that we've been talking about. In part, and to sort of aid in their assimilation. So you do have Yiddish-speaking Jews from Eastern Europe, arriving in the South, before 1890, but in 1890 and afterwards it really kind of ramps up. You have direct arrivals who come to Savannah, Galveston, New Orleans, as well as a number who come through Baltimore and sort of find themselves into what we might call the South proper. The southernness of Baltimore is a whole other conversation that someone else can lead. You also, of course, have Texas's specific example. I'm sure you're all fairly aware, but you have the Galveston movement from 1907 to 1914, which seeks to take Jews directly from Europe, bring them in through Galveston, and spread them into the U.S. interior. That's funded by the Jewish businessman Jacob Schiff of New York. That program wasn't particularly successful. But it did bring in 10,000 Jews through the port of Galveston, about 2,500 of which settled permanently in Texas during those years. And these sort of new Jews, right, they follow similar patterns to the Jews that came before. Many of them are peddlers, right, and they find their way from peddling into small businesses. So, you know, again, sort of this, it's this question of like, why, you know, there are two questions. One of them is why did the ones who came south come south? And then the other question is, for those who were successful in the South, they often found themselves asking, well, why don't more Jews come south? And one reason for that, of course, is sort of the rich Jewish life that they could have in New York City and in other northern urban environments. So here we've got a Yiddish, a Yiddish theater outside, or in New York City, the People's Theater. You know, of course, up here you've got English, but all these signs are in Yiddish. You've got a large group of folks gathered outside. You've got signs for Yiddish plays, right? You had this rich, not only did you have the infrastructure of an observant Jewish life, a kosher butcher, kosher restaurants, a moil, you know, a wide range of synagogues to choose from depending on your preferences, but you also had this developing secular Yiddish culture, right? Which was really exciting for European immigrants. You had Yiddish theater, you had Yiddish newspapers, right? You had, you know, Yiddish speakers getting up on soapboxes on every street corner, giving, yelling out their political views. I mean, you know, this sort of rich, amazing, vibrant sort of, you know, Yiddish life. In some ways more vibrant, not just something that had been imported from Eastern Europe, but actually something that was sort of homegrown and in many cases exported back to Eastern Europe. And those are all things that kept Jews in the urban Northeast. You also had less pressure to assimilate. You could live a Yiddish life in the Lower East Side, speaking primarily Yiddish with Yiddish-speaking neighbors. And I should also note that that sort of flood of Eastern European Jewish immigrants who mostly stay in New York actually makes the overall US Jewish population more northern. So let's see, so that by 1924, the Jewish population, or the US's Jewish population is only 5% Southern, right? So it's actually dropped from 13% before the Civil War, right? But there, of course, is a flip side to life on the Lower East Side and in these major urban enclaves. So what's this? Right. What, yeah, so this is exactly the sort of space that's recreated in the Tenement Museum, now in the Lower East Side, if you've ever been there. What, where are they? I mean, they're in a sweatshop, but what kind of space is this?
Somebody's apartment.
Yeah, this seems to be somebody's apartment. And what's the big clue there?
The living quarters were separated by glass, and infants were being raised on the other side of the glass, and their diapers were being boiled on the stove in the room where they were operating.
Right, and you've got, so we know from sort of the Tenement Museum and other things, right, that these are sort of living quarters that are also being used to do like sort of piecework, right? Someone's taking out a bunch of clothes from another shop, and they've got a group of people who work on those and then deliver them back to the manufacturer, right?
A breeding spot for tuberculosis.
Well, yeah, right, there's disease, there's noise, but what else? It looks like there's a ketubah on the wall, right? I mean, this just sort of speaks to sort of the crowdedness of this space, right? It's someone's living room, you know, gets used for this sort of grinding work all day, you know, and then you're expected, you know, it's a hard life. And that's the draw of the South, right? Is that you can start your own business, you can strike out on your own, that there are certainly sacrifices, right? But a number of Yiddish-speaking Jews who come to the South find that they can really make a way for themselves here. And I would like to point out, so this just related to sort of the idea that that sort of rich Yiddish-speaking world did find a place here, right? And so just a shameless plug, my dissertation research is about the development of the workman's circle or arbiter ring branches in the South, beginning in 1908 in Atlanta and in Dallas. And you can bring me back again to hear a lot about that. But here you've got a picture, I think this is 1940s. This is an anniversary banquet for the Galveston Workmen's Circle. And And then here in 1921 is the Jewish Monitor out of Fort Worth. This is a newspaper article about a Yiddish lecture by Shmuel Niger, hosted by the Dallas Workmen's Circle that drew 200 people. So you actually have a very interesting sort of Yiddish and in fact sort of Jewish left sort of milieu here in southern cities. And again, bring me back because it's my favorite thing to talk about. This sort of brings us to, of course, so what else is significant about the South? I've talked a little bit about the ruralness. I've talked a little bit about the relatively low density of Jews in the region. And of course, the other distinguishing feature of life in the South is the South's particular iteration of American white supremacy, right? The particular ways that labor, that residential patterns, that economic patterns were governed by racial, were governed by systems of race and racialization, right? So here you've got Becky Davis, was born in 1890, and she worked as a cook and maid for the Nat Berman family of Orlando from 1909 to 1970. She cooked all Jewish foods. So this image and the text, I think, speak to two things at once in a really powerful way. And those two things are this. First, Jews, the vast majority of Jews living in the South historically, and the majority in the present, are white. Whatever that might mean, right? Functionally have the privileges of white people, have the civic rights of white people, including, of course, enslaving black people prior to the Civil War. And so this text, in one hand, speaks to the position of white families as employers of black workers, right? Here you have a woman who works until she's 80 years old, in part because she's not collecting Social Security because of the way that Social Security laws were written during the New Deal. And so we can look at this in part as, sort of evidence of the ways that Jews have benefited from their racial standing, right? That they can afford to employ someone. We can also look to this and see, well, this is a woman who had a really long tenure with one family. Who may or may not have felt some actual sort of loyalty to them. We don't know if she was employed into her later years because, she was, it might have been the sort of thing where they kept her on to make sure that she had a steady income. We don't know. And there's a lot of anecdotal sort of evidence or anecdotal stories, right, about Jews being sort of relatively benevolent employers or as relatively respectful, business owners when it came to catering to black business. And sort of in this sort of one ambiguous picture, right, we've got sort of both sides of this coin, right? We see the ways in which sort of Jews have a particular position in Southern society, as well as possibly, and you can see it also with sort of her acquisition, her ability to cook Jewish foods, which anecdotally, so one of these stories is that, I think this comes from Eli Evans' book, The Provincials, but I'm not sure. This idea that in Durham, North Carolina, black women who worked in domestic capacities would recommend to one another to learn to cook Jewish foods because the rumor was that the Jewish households paid a little better and were slightly better employers. Now, I'm not saying that so that we pat ourselves on the back, but there is this dynamic, and it's worth exploring, and a number of sort of historians of Southern Jewry look into this in different ways. So I want to show a couple more sort of images just to talk about Jews and race. First, I should actually mention enslavement. So Jews tended to enslave African Americans and Africans at comparable rates as other Euro-Americans of their class, which is to say that that because Jews tended to be in port cities, tended not to be large-scale landowners, Jews who were well off enough to afford it typically had, maybe a small number of African American workers who worked, enslaved workers in their homes and in their businesses. So I think I was looking just like at what Dr. Stone has written. I think you mentioned a couple families in Galveston that had 4 to 8 enslaved people
Just around the house.
in their homes, right? Or, yeah, right. That with a few exceptions, Jews didn't tend to be large-scale plantation owners or sort of the large-scale slave traders who were enslaving hundreds of people, again, with a few exceptions. And as I mentioned, with the Civil War, there were Jews in the South who were ambivalent or, in a few cases, openly against slavery, but that does seem to have been the minority, right? It's not as if sort of Jewish religious ethics or Jewish experiences of persecution necessarily inoculated people to the ideologies that made enslavement okay in the antebellum South. Also note that sort of the antebellum economy north of south is predicated upon slave labor, so whether or not you own slaves is in some ways neither here nor there, because that's what makes life profitable in the country. So this is Corsicana, Texas, circa 1921. You've got, this is sort of labeled enigmatically as Hadassah play at the Old Ideal Movie Theater. Presumably this is a fundraiser for Hadassah, and what you can see is the three men crouching in the front wearing blackface, right? You've been there?
I grew up in Corsicana.
Oh, you did? Corsicana also, I just want to put a plug in for Corsicana's amazing historic double onion dome synagogue, which really is kind of a treasure, I think. So you've got this, and then of course, so what you see here right in this picture is the accommodation of Jews to essentially racist stereotypes and sort of racist tropes in popular culture. Not to say that Jews are peddling in this more than other people, but simply that part of living in the South is accommodating yourself to Southern culture, which involves this sort of thing, especially when talking about like Southern culture. And along with that comes sort of Old South commemoration. And so you've got Jane Wexler, second queen of the Natchez Pilgrimage, 1932. What do we see here? Southern Belle, right? Now, is this how people dressed normally in 1932? Right. What you've got is this trend of sort of a romanticized Old South past, right? One that operates in the 1930s to justify the continuation of segregation, right? And you see this Jewish woman who, hey, she won the Natchez Pilgrimage, right? We're talking about a very sort of genteel southern city, which has, obviously accepts Jews as a core part of white society, right? And so we're talking about, what was that?
Wearing a hoop skirt?
Yeah, and she's wearing this, very sort of historical sort of hoop skirt, right? It speaks to the ways in which Jews are very much integrated into southern society, especially in Natchez, which very much sort of trades on this Old South memory and romanticization even to this day.
I was going to say, it lasted a long time, because even when I was growing up, my brother was an escort for somebody for the Cotton Ball in Tennessee.
Yes, the Cotton Ball in Memphis, similarly, right. Yes, you've got the Cotton Ball in Memphis, you've got this in Charleston, and you've got really this in Natchez, you've got really the entire tourist industry of Charleston, right, is in many ways based on these same sorts of stories, right. And we continue to wrestle with questions of Confederate memorialization to this day. So I'll real quickly touch on civil rights. Again, that's a bigger topic. But Southern Jews, typically during sort of the classical civil rights era, 1954 till the late 1960s, are more supportive of desegregation and more supportive of black civil rights than their non-Jewish neighbors, but also less supportive than Northern Jews, right? And Southern Jews are, in some ways, put in a difficult position. In part, there's a real threat of violence. From November 1957 to April 1958, there are seven bombing attempts at synagogues and Jewish community centers, many through the South and several in South Florida as well. And 3 of those attempts succeed. There were no injuries in those attacks, right? But there was damage to buildings, most prominently at the Temple in Atlanta. Of course, if you've seen Driving Miss Daisy, that in many ways, sort of the parts of that film hinge on that bombing.
I moved here in 1980, and in my first Passover, Temple Emmanuel had bomb-sniffing dogs come through before every holiday.
So Temple, that's interesting. So she was saying that Temple Emmanuel had bomb-sniffing dogs coming through before the holidays as late as 1980, right? So that's really interesting. I want to kind of follow up on that. but I also want to push through with this. So this spate of bombings and bombing attempts in the late 1950s, right, has to do with this idea that Jews, and this is partly because national Jewish organizations have openly supported desegregation, that Jews are part of, a communist conspiracy to push desegregation on the South, right, as a threat to sort of white America and American freedoms. And it's interesting because it actually sort of, in some cases, it actually forces some Southern Jews to go ahead and come out more in favor of desegregation. This realization, okay, well, we're not going to be safe either way, let's go ahead and say what we really think, right? That's true in some communities, it's not so much true in Atlanta, I don't think. But then you have another spate of bombings and attempted bombings in Mississippi about 10 years later. Beth Israel congregation, where I go in Jackson, Mississippi, was bombed in September 18, 1967, and then the home of Rabbi Perry Nussbaum was bombed on November 21st of that year. Perry Nussbaum, of course, was famous for ministering to freedom riders who had been arrested in Jackson, Mississippi, and incarcerated at Parchman Penitentiary, right? And his comeuppance for being willing to go and talk to these Jewish civil rights activists, as well as black civil rights activists and white non-Jewish civil rights activists, was this bombing. So what you see here is, as I guess really the takeaway is, you see sort of Southern Jews caught between, in some cases, their sympathy and their empathy, and a real threat on one hand, from the sort of violent sort of terrorism of massive resistance, and on the other hand, they're also being pushed by Northern Jews to take more and more of a stance, and in many cases, they sort of balk at that and say, like, you're not down here, you don't have to live with the consequences. And again, it's a big topic, there's been a lot written on it, and maybe one that we can sort of delve into at another time. At any rate, the mid-20th century brings about, in some ways, sort of like a golden era, I would say, of like small-town Jewish congregational life, right? So here you've got the dedication ceremony of Bay City's Beth David Jewish Center in 1947. The Jewish Center in Bay City was not built really to be a synagogue. There was a synagogue in Wharton. So, the Jewish Center is there for religious classes, it's there for lay-led Friday night services, and it's there for social events. And this dedication, 1947, that's the same year that Temple Israel that I showed you in that first picture was dedicated. Right? You've got sort of this post-war moment of heavy congregational affiliation, of the baby boom, and you see in a number of small towns, sort of this mid-century moment. What was that? Okay, you see this sort of mid-century moment that is followed not too long by Jewish population decline in many small and medium-sized cities. So in the late 20th century, a number of trends lead to the closure or decline of small-town synagogues. So I imagine some of you recognize this building. Brenham, Texas, home of Bluebell ice cream, right? It had been there since, that particular building was built in 1893. The congregation had been there before that. It remained an Orthodox or traditional congregation for its entire tenure, which is somewhat interesting in a small town. But you've got a number of trends, right, throughout the South. First and foremost, I would say mechanization of labor. So if we're talking about the Mississippi Delta, as cotton farming depends on fewer workers, and as those workers move elsewhere in large numbers to seek their fortunes, and here I'm talking about African Americans moving north during the Great Migration, you have a smaller consumer base for that Jewish merchant class of many small towns. Following that, you get the professionalization of Jewish workers, right? You get 2, 3 generations of a family owning a store, but eventually, right, they're sending their kids to college. Right? And those kids who go to college oftentimes don't want to necessarily come back to the small town, right? Perhaps they want to pursue careers as attorneys, as doctors, as accountants, and they find their way to some of the larger centers. And then by the 70s and 80s, you have the rise of the box retail store, of the discount store, and then even more recently, right, of online retail. And all of this has led, right, to the decline of small-town Jewish life. And that really reshapes the South in many ways. And of course, we know in the case of Brenham, Texas, right, that actually led to the relocation of that synagogue building to the JCC campus in Austin, which really speaks to sort of this Sun Belt boom, right? Is that you've got places like Dallas and Houston and Atlanta, certainly, but also some sort of smaller centers in the region, Austin, Nashville, Raleigh, Durham, where you see significant growth, and whose Jewish populations are, growing. I don't know what the rate of affiliation is in, say, Austin or Nashville, if the rate of affiliation is keeping up with the population growth and presumably the Jewish arrivals, but you've got significant growth in these cities that at least, leads to a stable and likely growing Jewish community versus in many of these small places where you see decline. And so the result of this is that the Jewish South is more urban than it was 30 years ago, 50 years ago, or 100 years ago. And the other difference is that in many senses, it's not as southern either, right? So Atlanta's Jewish population, I believe, roughly doubled every decade from I think 1980 to 2010. It's something big. But of course, that's not because Atlanta Jews are multiplying that fastly, and it's not because they're drawing in so many Jews from the surrounding communities, right? It's because you've got Jewish folks coming from farther up the East Coast, right? I believe Houston's Jewish growth has more or less kept pace with overall growth, but not exceeded overall growth the way that Atlanta's has. At any rate, what you've got is places where a lot of the people who live there aren't necessarily from the region. And I would say, just sort of, is that true here in Dallas as well? Right, so you've got folks with long and deep roots in Texas, and you've got plenty of folks who are coming from metropolitan areas outside of the region. And so there's this question of whether, or in what, not whether, but in what way will the Jewish South continue to look or feel Southern in the future, right? And that's the big question going forward, a question that really was posed by Stuart Rockoff, one of my predecessors at the ISJL. So in response to this change, in response to both decline and growth, of course, we at the ISJL, right, have a history department, and we have our online encyclopedia of Southern Jewish communities. So if you just do a quick Google search for Institute of Southern Jewish Life, if you do a quick Google search for ISJL Encyclopedia, your top hit will probably be a page that looks a lot, but not exactly like this, because we've actually done a website update. I need to change the slide. And you can click on a state. Oklahoma, Kentucky, and Virginia are all done now. Florida will be done in the spring, Canahora. We'll see. It turns out writing Miami's history is taking a while. Florida will be available, let's say early summer. But you can click on a state. So if you click on Louisiana, you'll be presented with a list of essentially every community in Louisiana that developed a permanent Jewish institution, right? So that's typically a cemetery or a synagogue. In some cases, right, a Jewish center like we saw with the city. And if you were to click on Bogalusa, Louisiana, what you get is sort of a brief but substantive history of Jewish life in the area. And in the case of Bogalusa, in the case of Brenham, Texas, in a few other cases, those are actually enlivened by the inclusion of oral history videos. So that you could click on Sarah Stone's video here. She was a really significant person in, I believe, National Council of Jewish Women in New Orleans later on, yeah. But here she's talking about growing up in Bogalusa, her parents' business, and their sort of integration into the surrounding community. So I'd encourage you to look at the ISJL website to sort of learn more about the towns that you're from, or the towns that you might be interested in. And that sort of brings us up to the present. I'm happy to take some questions. Or actually, what questions do you have? Yeah.
Thinking back to the war with the Confederates and the Union, and difference in the politics coming to today and the Jewish population in the South versus the Jewish population in the North, how do we look at these two populations in terms of them being Democrats or Republicans? Do we see more Republicans in the South Jewish than the North?
I don't have, so the question was whether there are more Jewish Republicans in the South versus the North. And yes, I feel very comfortable saying yes. I don't have hard data on that. But I would imagine so. I mean, if you look at civil rights, if you look at several other sort of across the 20th century, I think you do see, again, Jews have acclimated to the South and the white South, and the white South is politically conservative. We know that, and so I do think that there's probably more conservative politics among Southern Jews than Northern Jews, but I don't have poll numbers on that.
In Dallas, when all the rioting was going on, what was it, 68?
Mm-hmm.
And there was picketing of restaurants in Dallas. One weekend evening, Stanley Marcus, me and Marcus called together as friends and said, do we want this or do we not want this? From a business point of view, we don't want it. And they integrated all the Hands and Sanders and Harris and Lee Marcus that had restaurants in one weekend.
Yeah. So
And it was no problem.
yeah. So saying that right, Jewish business people sort of looked at the situation in the late 60s here in Dallas and said, we just all need to agree to go ahead and desegregate our lunch counters, our restaurants. And in some cities, Jews were. So I would characterize the sort of dominant sentiment among Southern Jews during the Civil Rights Movement as one of sort of moderate progressivism, right? And one that essentially said, and there were exceptions, both sort of folks that were pushing harder in terms of civil rights, and also people who were really adamantly against segregation. I mean, there were Jewish segregationists. Clive Webb's book, Fight Against Fear, does a nice job of documenting a few of those books. But yeah, but dominantly, yeah, I would say it's sort of this again, sort of this moderate progressivism of let's not necessarily make a big show of it. Let's not necessarily like affirm direct action as a strategy, but to go ahead and sort of try to diffuse the situation, oftentimes behind the scenes. And if you look at the role of Southern rabbis in a number of cities, you kind of see that as well. And typically, though, it's sort of in the scheme of things, sort of I would say it's a stance predicated on the idea that African Americans should be extended privileges and civil rights based in part on their sort of playing along with respectability politics, I would say, is typically how, when I say do oral histories with folks, that's sort of the kind of thing I hear. There was a group in Jackson and some other cities called the Panel of American Women. Have you ever heard of it? Did Dallas?
Yeah, Dallas had it.
Okay, so Panel of American Women had this model where a Jewish woman, a white Protestant woman, a white Catholic woman, and an African American woman would be on a panel together. They would go to civic organizations, they would go to religious organizations, and they would talk about their experiences. And on one hand, this was an incredibly brave, progressive thing to do. But interestingly, the African American women, all the women involved here were solidly middle class, right? And that, so I remember I talked to a woman in Jackson who would talk about, she would have this group over. So there would be, an African American woman at her home. There would be a white Protestant woman. They'd be sitting around the table together. And she sort of mentioned something about she was very clear about sort of the class of people that were invited to participate in that. That this was very much, again, about sort of presenting, sort of black middle classness as the ideal that all black people should sort of aspire to, and that in a sense that they sort of needed to earn their way a little bit. And what I would say is sort of the limitation of that. Sort of mindset from like a contemporary sort of social justice perspective, but it very much sort of speaks to where these folks were. Yeah.
When you talk about the leadership that supported the civil rights movement in the South as really coming from the rabbis, were there marked differences between the rabbis within the different movements? And I assume that there were, that because, reform movement with its emphasis on social justice was out there a lot more.
Yeah, you see a stronger, certainly a stronger stances taken by some Reform rabbis. Not to say all, I mean, there were Reform rabbis who were
Silent.
who were silent at best. There was, Benjamin Schultz in Mississippi was, had sort of, well, whatever, anyways, out of his anti-communist convictions was also then pro-segregation, essentially, is my understanding. But is that about the right read on him? Yeah. I like, that book is sitting there, I just need to read it. But yeah, you see stronger participation by Reform rabbis. The Reform movement by this point sort of has really developed its sort of social justice stances. Off the top of my head, I'm trying to think of sort of vocal conservative rabbis. Brian, do you have a...
Conservative, religious conservative?
Yeah, like from the conservative movement?
Maleb
Okay.
is one who was pro-integration.
Okay, so there were...
He was reformed.
Rabbi Combs.
Yeah, but there were conservative rabbis in the South who came out not as strong, and then Orthodox rabbis were really pretty much sort of wasn't on their radar, I don't think.
Rabbi here, speaking of significant reform, it's Levi Ullman Dallas.
And Lefkowitz, right, Lefkowitz as well. Yeah, the Dallas's rabbis certainly deserve mention among those who, again, it tended to be sort of in many cases, sort of a quiet, sort of backroom push, but not entirely either. Yeah.
And Lefkowitz, defended the city against the Ku Klux Klan. He was out there.
Yeah. Yeah.
I'm curious about, Jews have been relatively accepted in the South, and with that has come a certain amount of assimilation. And yet, at the same time, it seems that in looking at Southern Jewish communities, there's a tremendous amount of nostalgia for keeping up with some Jewish traditions and hanging on to artifacts and things like that. And I'm curious.
So there's a lot of acceptance, there's a lot of acculturation, but there is, you look at a place like Brenham, where, the Tobin family in Brenham, they, sort of kept this place as a traditional shul, sort of, because it was what their family did, for a long time. I go to High Holidays at what's now essentially it's conservative practice, but it's in Greenwood, Mississippi, which for a long time was essentially an Orthodox congregation there in the Mississippi Delta, right? Then you get sort of this anchor family that holds on. And so there's a couple things to say about that. And not to say that the only way to sort of hang on and be authentic is to be Orthodox either. That whether we're talking about Reform Judaism, like my grandparents' Reform Judaism in Blytheville, Arkansas, or whether we're talking about Brenham, Texas, or Greenwood, Mississippi, I think there's a couple of things there. So you see this acceptance, you see a pretty high level of acculturation and integration into this sort of broader community, and especially the white community. But you're also in a very religious environment. And there's a great example of a congregation, I believe, in North Carolina. They're writing to someone, another Jewish organization, appealing for money to help build a synagogue. And they're saying, our neighbors think that we have no religion. It's embarrassing. We need to build a synagogue. And that you're in a religious region, right? When people meet you, they ask you what church you go to. I'm in Jackson, Mississippi. Like, people ask you what church you go to. And you say the Jewish church. And you don't say that, but that's what they're hearing. Being religious, having a place of worship is part of your civic identity here. And so you do see very high rates of affiliation among small-town Jews, right, if you're looking like the late 20th century. And in part, it's because that's what's expected. And in part, there's a sense where, listen, if you're living in the Lower East Side and it's 1930, you don't need to belong to a synagogue. You're Jewish because you live in the Lower East Side, right? It's that Lenny Bruce thing about, right? If he divides the world up into Jewish and Goyish, right? And it's like anything associated, like Count Basie is Jewish, New York City is Jewish. If you keep kosher and live in Minnesota, you're Goyish, like this sort of thing, right? Where in the South, if you want to be Jewish, if you want your kids to understand some type of Jewish identity, right, the way to do that is synagogue affiliation. And so you do, see examples of some really sort of tenacious holding on, and people going to great lengths. I mean, my grandparents, drove my mom probably 45 minutes to synagogue both ways, right? Macy Hart, who founded the Institute of Southern Jewish Life, if you've ever heard his stump speech, it's about his parents driving from Winona, Mississippi to Jackson, Mississippi every weekend, right? Which, 3 hours both ways, depending on how he's telling it.
Beaumont's an interesting example. My parents got married in Dallas in 30.
Okay.
My father had a job in Port Arthur. There weren't enough Jews for a minion, so they went to Beaumont to shul.
Yeah.
And there was a building there that had all three denominations, Orthodox, Conservative, and Reform in one building.
Oh, I didn't realize that.
Many years later, my son taught school down there in 10 years ago, still exists.
You're talking about the current synagogue I love the Beaumont Synagogue. It's got this gorgeous dome. So I didn't realize this. Apparently Beaumont would actually host sort of three denominations of services in one building, right? That in some ways,
in Pittsburgh, it's the same way.
yeah, but in some ways, sort of, right, the relative, right, you have to be able to make bridges across sort of, across what divides among sort of the branches of Judaism because your numbers are so small. You have to be able to sort of get along and make do with the group that you have until you hit a critical mass where someone can start a splinter group in a separate building, which is, of course, like our favorite thing to do. Let's take like one or two more. Yeah.
Was there anything left in the Southwest or the South of the Jews that escaped, a long time ago from the Spanish Inquisition?
So this question, right?
About all that.
This question of conversos or Marranos in the Southwest, as well as in Florida, is a somewhat vexing one. There's just not a lot of hard evidence of sort of the continuity of Jewish tradition or Jewish identification among Spanish colonizers. There's a fair amount of myth. There's some people who are very attached to those stories, and I don't want to poo-poo that. But in terms of sort of evidence that sort of meets criteria for most professional historians, there's just not a lot of evidence there.
Just to add, when I've had to answer that question, that was beautiful, by the way, very well done.
Yeah, thanks.
When I've given that answer, but there's not evidence to satisfy a historian, the response is frequently, well, of course not, they were living in secret. Right, so what evidence would you expect to see? And therefore now the absence of evidence becomes proof.
Yeah,
Must
I mean, it's
be
not,
true because there's no evidence.
Yeah, no, there's a little more evidence in New Mexico.
Yes.
So in New Mexico, there is sort of some evidence that there were.
I was thinking it's more the Southwest.
Yeah, in Texas, there's really not evidence. There's some people who are there's a group in St. Augustine who are very dedicated to the idea that there was an early sort of Spanish Jewish presence in St. Augustine. But as far as I can tell, it's not conclusive evidence.
We get asked a lot at the historical
Yeah,
society.
and
We get a lot of calls.
Yeah, and what I wouldn't discredit or dismiss is the significance of those narratives to Latino Jewish people today. And there's a colleague at Rice who's done some interesting sort of work on this. I wouldn't be dismissive of that. It's just to say that there's not a lot of hard evidence. Well, thanks a lot. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Josh. It was our pleasure to host you, and we hope that you will join us again for the next in our series, which will be in January, and it's called Secret Dallas. It's January 24th, and it's things you didn't know about Dallas and might be surprised to find out. So again, Josh, thank you for your talk, and we really appreciate it.